All right. All right, everybody. Welcome back to Failure TV. I'm your host, Cray Mitchell. My next guest is a New York Times bestselling true crime author, and I am very pleased to welcome Catherine Pelonero. Catherine, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Cray. It's a pleasure.
Yes, and we were just talking about holiday seasons and everything. I was glad to hear that you had a good holiday season. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself and what you're currently doing?
Sure. As Cray said, my name is Catherine Pelonero, and I am a true crime author. My first book was titled Kitty Genovese, A True Account of a Public Murder and Its Private Consequences. And if you have any true crime fans out there, they were more than likely familiar with the Kitty Genovese case. It was very high profile, notorious murder that happened in 1964. And that book was released in 2014, became a New York Times bestseller. That was actually my first book. And my latest book is called Absolute Madness, a true story of a serial killer, race in a city divided. And that came out in November of 2017. And that was actually just recently optioned for film.
Awesome. That's great news.
Yes, it is. It is.
I'm actually a collector of first editions of books turned into movies that I enjoy. So I've got a lot of fun things. My 1930 Scarface first edition is probably one of my favorite.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine. Exciting.
I also have a Truman Capote In Cold Blood.
First edition?
Yeah.
Very nice.
Yes.
Very nice. I love that movie, too, with Philip Seymour Hoffman.
Oh, it was so good, wasn't it? So sad about him.
I know.
Anyway, you've been an author for a while now. Obviously, getting into being an author is not an easy task. You've probably faced many roadblocks along the way. Why don't we start out? How would you define failure yourself? How do you define failure yourself to you?
Oh, wow. You know, failure is it's one of those loaded words. You know, it can mean so many different things. And it's usually, I mean, obviously it has a negative connotation. It means for one reason or another, something didn't go as planned or as one would hope it went. You know, and then there are all the cliches about turning it into an opportunity or, but you know, cliches, they're around for a reason because there's some truth in them. And it's very interesting. I could tell you briefly about, I started out as a playwright. And I wrote comedies mainly.
Really?
So writing true crime was a big switch for me. And when I undertook to write Kitty Genovese, I had never written a book before. And writing for the theater, you know, scripts and screenplays, stage plays, entirely different, completely different animal from writing a book. So I was really starting from ground zero, even though I was already a published and produced playwright. You know, for all intents and purposes, I'm starting from ground zero. And I went and I got books, how to write nonfiction, how to write true crime. And of course, having no track record in the business, Kitty Genovese, I can't tell you how many publishers rejected it, you know, at first. Yes, exactly. Well, I had no track record as a nonfiction author. I was a playwright. The two really don't you know, translate terribly well as far as fan bases or publishers. And I actually managed to, this is a failure and a learning lesson. I signed with an agent. There was an agent who actually heard about my book. A colleague of mine had given an interview and mentioned this, that I was writing this book. And I signed with her against my gut instinct, against my better judgment, because my thinking was, well, you know, I'll have the agent. And I didn't know anything about literary agents at the time. They're very different from theatrical agents. So I just figured, okay, well, I'll get that out of the way. And she was absolutely the wrong agent for me. So long story short, she submits it to all these different publishers. So she says, and it keeps getting rejected. And, you know, a few months go by. And finally, she has this phone call with me. And it tells me that, you know, this isn't going to work because I don't have time to teach you how to write. And maybe you should take a writing course at a university. And I mean, and this came just completely out of the blue. I mean, this is someone who sought me out. It was so enthusiastic. And, you know, she loved my sample chapter of the book. And so it was crazy. So about a week later, there was a friend of my, a friend that was over, and who also happens to be a writer, really an acquaintance, but he's a sports writer. And I mentioned to him this experience I had with his agent. I said, you know, can you believe that she said that to me? So the following Monday, I get an email from this acquaintance of mine, the sports writer, and he said, you know, I'm writing a book right now. I'm with Skyhorse Publishing, and I was telling my editor about your project, and she was very interested. Can you send her your proposal? Because nonfiction books are done with proposals.
Mm-hmm.
So I did, and long story short, in less than 2 weeks of that agent telling me I couldn't write, I had the book sold myself.
That's how it's done.
Yes, exactly. And I attribute that as, you know, I wanted that so badly, and I believed in the story. This was a story that I absolutely had to tell. And I think that's what really propels us. And as far as making the mistakes and having failures, it comes with the territory, and certainly not with writing, I mean, with anything in life. The point is, you know, you have to be strategic, you know, look at your goal and educate yourself. As I said, I read how-to books. I read scores and scores of true crime books to learn. And I wasn't put off by the rejections. Well, as a writer, I mean, that's sort of par for the course anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's sort of how I got here. And so I certainly did not start out as a book writer, and, you know, came from a genre that's about as different could be. But then I tell people I sort of fell into true crime writing and found that I really love it. And what I love about it is the process, the research.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of work, but I find it very, very stimulating. So
I can totally understand that. I honestly was never a fan of history growing up as a kid. The only thing that ever really caught me was Pompeii, like the history of everything getting covered in ash and everyone frozen in time. Like that always stuck with me, but never really interested. But as I grew older, all the historical stuff started making more sense and actually making me want to do research into stuff. And I'm actually doing a bunch of historical research on magicians right now and magic stuff. So it's quite interesting seeing all this historical stuff. So it's totally along those same lines. It's really interesting to know that you were a playwright beforehand. What kind of made you want to make that switch? Like, was there something in life, or what kind of happened?
Well, you know, no, and it really wasn't a conscious switch. I never sat down and said, okay, now I'm going to write true crime. What happened was I was so grabbed by this story, the story of Kitty Genovese. And if you're going back a few years, before I wrote the book, there was very little information out there, other than sort of the iconic New York Times news story that came out at the time, and, you know, the one that went viral, 1960 style. There was really no information about Kitty Genovese as a person, or about Winston Moseley, the man who killed her. And I wanted to find out more. So the more I found out, and then I found out that there was a part of the story that most people didn't know, that I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and my father was actually a police officer there for 34 years.
Oh, wow.
In a way, it's natural that I became a true crime writer.
Yeah.
But Winston Moseley murdered Kitty Genovese in 1964, was first sentenced to death, and then that was overturned and commuted to life in prison. He was serving a sentence at Attica when he escaped in March of 1968 in Buffalo. And from a hospital in my hometown, and went on a rampage there for 3 days. So there was that part of the story. But anyway, the point is, I was so grabbed by the story, and I actually spent a total of 7 years on that book, on Kitty Genovese, because there was such a learning curve there too. But I think my thought was, I think I might have even have told some of my colleagues at the time, you know, I just have to write this book, and then I'm going back to comedies and stage and plays. I mean, I had no intention of becoming a nonfiction writer or a true crime writer. But as I said, it just kind of happened.
You never know where life's going to take you sometimes. I can't tell you how many times I've made plans.
Yeah, sure. It's important to try new things, you know, but that especially, if something's really driving you, if something really grabs you, that's a good indication. You know, if your gut is telling you, oh, I need to do this, or I need to tell this story, that's a good thing to follow.
Absolutely. I'm a big advocate for following your dreams. There's a t-shirt brand called Johnny Cupcakes, and his slogan is "Do more of what makes you happy." And I absolutely love that. And I try and do that more in my day-to-day life too. And I think the fact that you were able to find that in totally an off kind of way that you didn't even plan, like that's so amazing. And even cooler that your dad was a police officer for so many years. Did you have any interest when you were younger in true crime, like movies or TV or books or anything back then?
You know, I remember reading a number of true crime books, when I was younger. But I enjoyed reading them because I thought there were some interesting stories out there. But I never had a thought that, oh, I'm going to write this myself. I never had any interest in crime writing or being a reporter. Really, for me, it was all about theater. Yeah. And I absolutely loved being a scriptwriter. And I miss it because I do want to write some more scripts. I wrote a short script a couple months ago just because I wanted to. So I loved, it's not that I didn't like theater, I didn't like script writing anymore, but as I said, I just kind of fell into this and just kind of like, oh my gosh, this is just my thing. It was sort of my calling.
So what got you into theater writing to begin with? Like, what got you into script writing originally? Was that something that you'd wanted to do when you were younger and went into, or how did you get into that?
And my parents were very big readers, and we loved going to garage sales and swap meets where you can get the inexpensive books. And a next door neighbor of ours had a garage sale, and my parents picked up a book of the collected works of William Shakespeare, which I have to this day.
Wow.
And I started reading that, and I'm thinking I was maybe 10, something like that. I was very young.
That's an early age.
I was very young. But I was I'm the oldest of 5. I guess I was just one of those precocious kids or whatever. But anyway, I was just fascinated with theater. And then at school, we had, there was a book of the musicals, Oklahoma, the scripts for the musicals, Oklahoma and Carousel. And I read those. And that's when I decided, oh, I'm going to be a playwright. And I think I was in 6th grade. I've always been a writer, been writing since I could hold a pen or type, but that's what got me into theater, the collected works of Shakespeare.
Wow. So how old were you when you wrote your first script that actually turned into
very
something?
Young, 8th grade. Yes.
Really?
Although I must say I wrote a novel in 7th grade.
Oh, wow. I wrote a short story in 7th grade, I think.
Yeah. So I always sort of had that determination. And of course, as you can imagine, my musical, which was called Showtime, that was my first script in 8th grade, and the novel before that, which I think was called The Best School Year Ever. I mean, they're obviously silly things that I would never bring out. But I always encourage kids, if they have that desire to write, go ahead and write your novel, because believe it or not, that was great practice for me. And the more you write, it's like anything else, the practice, the better you get.
Absolutely.
Right.
I think
not be afraid to fail.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's one of, I think the biggest things that people struggle with is overcoming that fear of the failure. I think you probably got over that quite early if you were writing a novel in 7th grade.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think all of us, not to get too philosophical, but all of us in one way or another were held back by fear of something. But by fear, not when it came to career things or writing. I was always willing to put it out there and keep trying, and keep learning. I think what's most important when it comes to so-called failure or setbacks is to take something from it. When I would get a rejection or later on I would have a play reading or rehearsal, things weren't going well. I tried to pay attention and learn from it. It's like, why did this fail? Why did this go wrong? So that perfect example of failure as a great experience. Live and learn. Absolutely. I feel like my newest book, Absolute Madness, which is my second book, I feel it's far superior to Kitty Genovese in the sense of the structure, just because I learned so much the first time. So
Absolutely. Are you working on any new books as well right now?
Yes, I'm actually working on two.
Oh, wow.
Yes, and one is nonfiction and one is fiction. I'm actually going to try some crime fiction, and I started writing this story that just kind of grabbed me right before Christmas, and I'm just going to go with it and see where that goes. And the other is a new true crime book called More Than Murder, and it's a collection of stories and cases that I've come across that I thought were really compelling and intriguing, but I didn't think they merited a full book treatment. But they were certainly worth telling, even in a shortened form.
Yeah.
So that's the next true crime project, and between that and the crime novel, yeah.
Excellent. I really love the idea of that because, like you said, there's a lot of stories out there that you probably wouldn't even be able to get published as a full book because you'd have to fill it with so much filler. But
sure.
Some of the best books ever written were short story books and have a bunch of short stories in them. But I don't recall. I've read a lot of true crime. I don't recall reading any compilation style books. So that's
well, there are some. Anne Rule did some. Anne Rule did a series called Anne Rule's Crime Files, I think, and it was sort of along the same line, sort of a collection of cases that she had come across, and she would write about a chapter on each. So mine would be a little bit longer than that, but it's a similar idea. But they're really unusual murder cases that just grab me.
Yeah, I think those could be very interesting as well. And I like what you said about like overcoming setbacks and stuff and keeping at it and keeping up practice. One thing that I love that people can just go out and search on YouTube now is people putting up like time lapses of things like becoming an artist and some of their early drawings and then redrawing the same drawing over like the period of 3 years and seeing that progression. And I think more people would feel a lot better about themselves and be more willing to put themselves out there for stuff like that if they watched more stuff like that, to see that everybody runs into these situations and it's not something that, that's going to destroy them for life. Like everybody's going to run into a so-called failure. Have you come across anything, or have you experienced that you would consider a significant failure over the years? And how did you overcome that?
You mean career-wise?
Yes.
I'm trying to think. The things that I think of as my biggest failures career-wise is sometimes I beat myself up and think, I really wish I had written more. I wish I had been more disciplined when I was in my 20s, and instead I was going out with friends and doing this and that. And, I think, well, I could have had much more of a body of work. But the underlying thing there is, if people were to ask me what is the single most important quality for a writer to be successful, I would say self-discipline. Because it really is important, and of course that's something that came to me with maturity, and after I became a mother, especially, because you really got to be disciplined when you have kids. But as far as big career failures, I wish I had a better answer for you. I mean, I've certainly have plenty of rejections, but I guess I never, from the time I was a kid, I always saw rejection as part of the business. So yeah, I mean, there's never been a time when I felt like, oh, this is just going to crush me. To be honest, I sort of take it in stride. I kind of never expected it to be easy, I guess.
Good attitude to go into it with. Like, I always go into things, you prepare for the best, but expect the worst. Because then, whatever happens, it's going to happen. So is there anything that you do, to get yourself motivated, like when you've got to write something? Because we all come over the procrastination days, the days that the bed is just so comfy. And what kind of stuff do you do to make sure that you keep going on those days? What keeps you going on those days?
Oh, I have a couple tricks for that. One thing I found is that any sort of I have to do something physical to get my mind going, and it's got to be something repetitive. Like sometimes I will, any sort of activity. Like I'll walk. I like to do like aerobics sometimes in my bedroom, like dancing. I use the term dancing loosely, but exercise.
Me too.
And also things like, and believe it or not, housework. something like cleaning windows, and nice little house in California, lots of windows here.
Yeah.
But believe it or not, anything like that, you're washing a window, it doesn't take much mental exertion. Because I don't have to concentrate on what I'm doing physically, it lets my mind wander. My imagination starts going. And it sounds silly, but it's really true. Anything you're going to do that's sort of repetitive and dull, doesn't take a lot of mental, focus on it, your mind is going to get bored and it's going to go off on different directions. So that's when I do a lot of my best writing. And of course, the physicality of it, I think that's much more stimulating than if you're, say, sitting in a chair. So that's why that's like one of my big go-tos, whether it be taking a walk, washing windows, anything that's sort of repetitive. The worst thing is for me to just sit there and think. I can't just, okay, I'm going to come up with an idea now. That does not work for me. It's got to be
blank page.
It's got to stay in motion. And if you keep your body in motion, I found that it triggers your mind too. The mind will also stay in motion. The other thing that I do to make myself work, and I think, and this is brilliant, a friend of mine who is an attorney told me this one. When I was working on Absolute Madness, I was so overwhelmed by it because it turned out the book was, once I really got more into the research, it was going to be far longer, a bigger project than I had originally pitched and thought. And, just the thought of, oh my gosh, I can't do this. So he told me, well, this is what you do. He says, sit down and tell yourself that you're going to work for 10 minutes. And I said, well, I need to work for longer than 10 minutes. He says, do it for 10 minutes. And of course, we have the nice little clock at the bottom of the computer screen. Mm-hmm. And he said, I use that trick on myself. He said, if I have a legal brief to write or something I don't want to do. He said, so look at the clock, say, okay, it's 7:21 now. I'm going to work till 7:31. He says, it's easier for you to take than, okay, 10 minutes, I get a break. I only have to do 10 minutes. He says, and more often than not, you'll work longer. You'll overwork. Believe it or not, it works. Works for me every time. I mean, it's really amazing. And I did that. Yeah. I started that. I'm like, okay, it's going to be 10 minutes. There's just something about when you're getting a reward in 10 minutes, you're giving yourself a little break and sometimes saying, okay, I'm only working for 10 minutes and then I'm going to go get a Diet Coke, or something like that, knowing you have sort of that little treat. And sure enough, and 10 minutes would turn into 20 minutes because then you get yourself in the mode. So I'm a big believer in all those little psychological tricks we can play with ourselves, to get us motivated. And those are two of my favorites. They really work.
I really like those, actually. I've never heard of the 10-minute one before, and I think that's a great possible solution for many people in that situation. I've I've run into that more times than I can count too. But you're right. Like as soon as you get into it and you get going and you start getting on the roll, then you just really don't want to stop. And of course, that can be a bit of a problem too when you just can't stop and you end up, well, I'm going to do an hour or two of work here. And then 6 hours later, it's just like, well, that's just not going to happen now. And just trying to get it to that perfect point before you leave it. And there's no point there. What are your thoughts on striving for perfection when you're trying to do something? Like when you're writing for a book, are you going for perfect, or are you going for, this is what I want to do and I'm making it as solid as possible? How do you deal with the end game, or sorry, not the end game, the end goal? How do you get it to stop before you go into the tweaking all the little things and trying to make it perfect all the time? I've run into that as a graphic designer and web designer. It could be finished, but you go, how do you keep yourself from going into those little, it's got to be perfect?
Okay. Well, first of all, I don't strive for perfection. I strive for excellence. And that's something that I tell my boys, never mind perfection. That's striving for so-called perfection is almost an excuse to not do your work because there's no such thing as perfection. So that's why I never start out with that mindset, but I'm going for excellent. And what I do is, I've heard other writers say, you have to give yourself permission to fail, so to speak. Give yourself permission to write something bad. You just got to get something out on the page. Generally, and by the way, there is no right or wrong way when it comes to writing. as far as, you know, some people do formats, some people just start writing, some people write a chapter in the middle. Whatever works is really the right way. What I do is at first I use my trick where I'm doing something physical. So I'm getting my mind working. And then I will typically have like a big pad and I will do bullet points. This is what has to happen in this chapter. So, and I'll start writing that. Now, generally, my first drafts are pretty solid because I spend a lot of time on the first draft.
Yeah.
And I have, to be perfectly honest, I have done that to myself where I will sit for, 2-3 hours on one paragraph. I mean, that has happened to me and it's very frustrating, but then once I get it, then I'm off to the races. So, and of course, what should be said is that you do have to resist that temptation to, you can be fiddling with your work forever. So you do have to, one thing that's really nice about having a publisher is that you have deadlines. And, your editor says, okay, I need it by this time, and, you've got to produce, and you're beholden to someone. So that really helps. But as far as the excellence, I have a couple of trusted readers, people who read my work. And then I think I've reached the point too where I'm very honest with myself about about my work. I know if it's working and if it's not. And as far as and I think that comes from confidence and experience too. So yeah, I trust my readers, the couple of handpicked people who I have, and it's a matter of trusting yourself too and not overdoing it. Because it's not about, I tell myself, I'm writing this for other people to share with other people. This is not about my ego, where it's got to be, the greatest.
Good way to think of it.
Yeah, it's got to be, is it an interesting story? Am I giving them the facts? Am I staying true? Does it flow? Those are the things I ask myself.
That's awesome. I've done
not
a documentary.
Am I going to win the Pulitzer Prize?
I've written a documentary and a short film, and I ran into some kind of the same kind of thing where, especially with that first one, I really wish I had gotten some kind of funding or broadcast rights or something like that to give me that deadline, because I definitely spent way more time than I should have in some areas, because I didn't realize that, I couldn't make it perfect. It was perfect in my mind, how I wanted it. But, once you go over it a couple times and then you scrap that entire thing, I'm sure you've done that, where you spend all those hours on that paragraph or two and scrap it.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And I should mention too, that in times past, I've certainly done that, I had a piece of work that I'm fiddling with it forever. But it's another one of those things with experience, I would just realize, okay, this isn't working for whatever reason, I'm going to put it aside. And some things I would go back to, some things I wouldn't. Yeah. So it's just sort of that keeping myself in motion, and also not wrapping myself up, trying not to wrap myself up in just one thing. I have 2 books going now. That doesn't mean that I typically write multiple books. But even when I'm in the midst of a big project like Kitty Genovese or Absolute Madness, I will be jotting down ideas for other things. So
I have a couple of files going with different things, because come up with the idea, I'm going to save this in here, for later, right. And then they just develop over time. I'm not sure. Have you ever used Evernote?
I haven't. No. Do you like it?
Quite like it for doing stuff like that. I definitely check it out. It's got a great browser extension that allows you, like, as you're browsing the web and you just come across something and you think about it, you can just really quickly save it to your Evernote, give it some tags, or put it in a category and forget about it until later when that comes back to you. So, okay, something that I recommend at least checking into.
Oh, definitely. No, a lot of times I use my iPhone, the notes section of my iPhone. If something comes to me, type something in there. So
it's super quick. Much better. Yeah. Oh, no, Notes works too. Even though I have Evernote on my phone, sometimes you just bring up notes and you type something in. So it's like you said earlier, whatever works. Like everybody's going to have a different process, and I think that's also a very good thing that people should realize is just because this method works for this one person doesn't mean it's going to work for you. Like
exactly.
Find your own path.
Right, and trusting yourself too.
Exactly. In everything that you've written, have you ever started something, like gotten partway through it and just put it aside and come back to it later to finish writing and made that into something? Or are you more get the whole thing done or scrap it?
There have been things that I put aside and then came back to, but finished them. But that's rare. There's also dozens and dozens of things that I started, both plays or short stories or whatever, and just, have them in a file folder in the cabinet that I just abandoned for whatever reason. And maybe once in a blue moon, I'll go and look at that file and maybe I'll take something back but I hang on to them for a couple of reasons, sort of, I'm a saver. I'm one of those people who saves things. But it's sort of, it lets me gauge like sort of how far I've come. I'll compare something, a play that I started writing 5 years ago to, something I've done more recently. And as you were saying on YouTube, the sort of the delayed action videos where you can, see the progress of something. Yeah. I think that's important too. It's good to save those things. I'm glad that my mother saved my short stories and all the stuff I wrote when I was a kid, because, well, for one thing, it's nice to look back on. But I really do consider that progress in my career as a writer. That was all practice, Yeah. So
stepping stones to take you further in life.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Breaking things down into those little steps.
I had a friend who was used to be a musician years ago, and he once told me I really liked one of these songs that he'd done like 6 years before, and he's like, "Get rid of that, it's old stuff." I'm like, man, like, come on, like that's like telling the Rolling Stones or the Beatles to throw out their first albums because it was their early stuff. Don't listen to it. Like, you're an artist, like whether you're a writer or musician, like you are going to be your harshest critic every time. Like people will give you,
and we should be.
Yeah, people will give you awards, and you're still going to think it's crap. But I think that just drives to make you do more and go on to the next thing and push that forward as well. Right.
Yes, I agree.
Got to have that starting point somewhere, right?
Oh, without a doubt. Yes. And there is something to, one of the popular things that writers like to say, oh, you have to write every day. Now, I don't. I've never been that person. But for some people, as I said, if it works for them, but to me, I'm more the kind of person who, when I am writing, I'll write a lot. I'll write a great deal in a day. And then I can put something aside and maybe not really write anything of substance for a couple of weeks. That's just me. Yeah. But as you can see, I finished 2 books, and Kitty Genovese and Absolute Madness are not short books. Yeah. They're both, substantial hardcover books. So really just going along with what you said, because I do think sometimes people, especially when they're starting out, they tend to get discouraged if they're not following the so-called rules. Well, I didn't write every day, or I didn't do an outline. Don't think that you have to. I'm all in favor of giving those things a try. I mean, certainly it's good to listen to people who are accomplished in whatever field that is, and, learn from their experience. But, you have to pick and choose, take what works for you and discard what doesn't.
I couldn't agree more with that. And I think I've been telling people that my entire life. Just some people don't always listen to that. It's just like, no, you gotta follow. It says that you got to do this, so you got to do this. I'm like, yes, you do in some instances, but look at it from another angle and see where that gets you. Because as your perfect example, looking at something a little bit differently and starting something could lead to a whole new thing for you. So it's
yes, absolutely,
it's something great. And you know what? That's a perfect lead into my last question for somebody that's just getting started out and they've got an idea that they might want to do, but they're a little hesitant. What kind of advice would you give them if they came to you like, could you mentor me? Tell me how to get started. What would you suggest?
What I would suggest is sort of doing it the same way I did. Start from the ground up and read the how-to books. If you want to write nonfiction, go and get yourself some books, how to write a nonfiction book proposal. That's the most important, is to educate yourself. And I would think, and this is something I can share that gave me a great edge from the time I was a very, very young writer and starting out. I was always striving for professionalism. And while there are no rules when it comes to creative process, there are definitely rules when it comes to the submission process, the publication process, production process. Very early on, I worked in a theater in Buffalo, New York, and I was reading, was doing dramaturg work. I was reading some of the play scripts that were coming in. And of course, we had guidelines, we're looking for this type of script. And it was just amazing, the number of people who would send in something that was completely wrong. They obviously had not bothered reading our guidelines. They would send us scripts that had like a coffee stain on it, or it wasn't formatted properly, and those things really were discarded pretty quickly. So that's my big thing. Be a professional. Don't send out things that look terrible. Do your homework, know what you're, know the proper format, be a professional. Those are really crucial things. So that's what I would tell people. And also read a lot, especially in the genre that you want to write in. I mean, if you want to write mysteries, read a lot of mysteries and the whole gamut. When I really learned how to write true crime by reading true crime, and I'll share this too. I did not just restrict myself to reading the classics, In Cold Blood and The Onion Field. I mean, I certainly read all of those books. But I also made a point of going to our YMCA used to have used book sales, and I would pick up true crime paperbacks from true crime books that no one had ever heard of, because I wanted to know, why weren't these books successful? And I learned a lot. I learned the mistakes. So that's another good thing to keep in mind. You can learn from as much from someone's mistakes and failures as you can from someone's successes. And certainly I'm not going to mention any authors or titles, but it did become clear to me why these books were very successful and sold well and they resonated with readers, and why these others were just never went anywhere. And, and once you learn that, then you can learn, okay, oh, now I see.
That is a really good piece of advice. And I think that will span across many different industries and not just writing. Like, look at the competition that was really well done, and when you're looking at the top 100 lists, don't look at just the top 10, look at the 99 and 100s and see what the difference is.
Oh, absolutely. It's like reading the 1 and 2 star reviews on Amazon. It's going to give you a different perspective on something.
Absolutely. I actually read, I always look at the 5-star, the 1-star, and the 3-star, because I want to know what what's that middle ground for people. But with reviews, you never know.
Well, that's true. That's true.
Yes. Anyway, Catherine, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been great chatting with you. And for those of you that haven't read her books, definitely, where can they go to get them?
Pretty much anywhere. They're at Amazon and bookstores all over the place. Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Audible, iTunes. They're all over the place. Excellent.
Anywhere you find good books.
Yes. And they can certainly, look on my website, which I'm redoing, doing another website overhaul. That's been my project, teaching myself how to do that. And that's www.catherinepelonero.net.
Excellent. And we'll put that in the link in the description as well for people. Catherine, thank you so much for coming on today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Craig. It was a pleasure.
All right. And everybody listening at home and watching at home, you guys have a great night, evening, and we'll see you again next month.